Hello, everyone. I am Melody Yan, founder of Author Nation. Author Nation is a community for authors by authors. So if you want to be a successful nonfiction author, join us. You can join us at authornationtube.com/join. That is in the description and it's scrolling past you right now. Today, we are talking about working through grief and finding your voice with your writing. And today's guest is Brenda Smit-James. Born in South Africa, Brenda was a high school teacher before moving with her husband to Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, 25 years ago. In Vancouver, Brenda switched careers. She worked as a bookkeeper, accountant, and entrepreneur. And in this time, writing kind of took a back seat. However, after her mother's death, it became a tool to process and express her grief. Writing has since become Brenda's life purpose. She writes to explore God's great love for humankind, and she teaches memoir writing on YouTube to help others capture their stories. Let's welcome Brenda. Hi, Brenda. How are you today?
I'm fine. Thank you, Melody Ann.
So you grew up in South Africa. I'm so curious. What was school like for you when you grew up? What did you guys read in English class?
I find it intriguing that's an interesting question. It's so many years ago I was at school. I've got to go, oh, what did we do? Well, first of all, schools in South Africa, you wear a school uniform. So there's this uniform look that everybody wears and goes to school. And I think then after that, school is pretty much, I think, the same as you would find over here. Perhaps there in South Africa, when I was growing up, the school system was very academic focused. So not many life skills, more just academia, getting subjects and knowledge and understanding what that is. So with regard to the books I read, I thought about it. I cannot think of any English set works I did except for two. And one is, I think because they left an impression on me. And the first one is Macbeth by Shakespeare. It's the first Shakespearean play I read. And I think part of me had this trepidation that I wasn't going to understand Shakespeare. But I read Shakespeare and I loved it. I read Macbeth and I love Macbeth. So that one sticks in my mind. And the other one was the book Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Oh. And I totally loved Rebecca. I loved the mystery and the intrigue of it. I love the setting of it. I love any books that are set in houses or homes. And so I just fell in love with Rebecca. And Daphne du Maurier has actually become somebody who I really, as a writer, find inspiring.
Oh, that's amazing. I thought you were going to say Shakespeare because, here when I was growing up, we did Shakespeare every year. Every year we did a different Shakespeare. So I was kind of like, I bet she's going to say Shakespeare, but yeah, Rebecca, that's great. That's amazing. That's something I did not read in high school. So that's very exciting.
Yeah.
And I just want to say hello to Essetino Media who are watching today. They say, hey, Brenda and Melody. Hello, Essetino Media, Orit. How are you guys today? And Jewel, I hope you are doing well. I'm really excited about the topic today. So you must have liked kind of reading and writing in high school because you became a teacher. So what inspired that?
I think, I don't know that I was inspired to be a teacher. I think I became a teacher because as growing up when I did in the 70s and in South Africa, I don't know what it was perhaps like here in Canada, but there were only a few jobs that were promoted as being available to women: teaching, nursing, and being a secretary, and perhaps a bookkeeper. So those are like the four main topics. And I didn't grow up in a family where we were like career oriented and you're going to get a career and you're going to make something of your life. I think that's perhaps a terminology that's become more popular within the last 20 years. So it was like, you're going to grow up, you're going to have a job to keep you busy, you're going to get married, you're going to have children. And teaching is just great because you get holidays, you work half days, and it works really well with raising a family. So you kind of had this as your career set out for you. And secretary didn't quite appeal to me. Bookkeeping I could have done, but wasn't something I really thought about either. And nursing at the time didn't appeal to me either. So I was at school. I loved a lot of my teachers. So I just sort of fell into teaching because that's what women do.
Yeah.
So that was kind of, I was never inspired to be a teacher. It's kind of what was an option for me to pursue.
That's really interesting. It's like, okay, I have 4 options, pick one.
Yeah.
And this is the best option rather than I dream of, right? Which
Yes.
is, I think, how we talk to kids today, right? You know, what
Yes.
you dream of being, how can we help you get there, right? Rather than here are your options, pick one. And then you switched careers when you came to Canada. So and you said you became a bookkeeper accountant, which was on the list of options. So did you kind of expand what was possible when you came, or were you still picking from those 4?
So, I think what happened was I was good at accountancy or accounting at school, but we only did it in grade 8. And then the teachers that taught accounting actually moved out of that field and they went into the business sector because they got paid more. So then I didn't pursue it at school. It dropped as a subject and I never continued it. And I love French. French and history were my 2 favorite subjects when I was at school. So when I finished graduating in grade 12, I had a gap year that I chose for myself. And I just happened to fall into a job. Feels like some of my life was just kind of happening to fall into things. With somebody I knew from our church who had a business, and he asked if I wanted to come in and help their bookkeeper with the books. So I said yes. So I had 1 year of being a accounts receivable clerk. And so when we came to Canada and I needed to find a job, you're a new immigrant, nobody knows you, nobody's going to hire you. And I realized I didn't want to continue with teaching. I thought, well, I have this 1 year of bookkeeping experience. Maybe I should try find a job in that field. And I did, a very entry-level position. And again, I just fell into books and bookkeeping and realized that I was actually really good at it. And so then continued to study and worked as an accountant.
Yeah. And then the audience may not know but then your mother passed away, and that's what brought you back to writing. So was that a purposeful decision, or was there an impulse to write?
I started moving back into writing before my mother passed away. So in my late 30s, which was probably about 9 to 10 years before my mom passed away, I went through a change of life depression. A lot of women, and we don't talk about this, it happens for men too. We go through a depression sort of in our late 30s, maybe 40, early 40s, depending on where you are in that. So it's a life evaluation time and phase in our lives. So I went through this, went into deep depression, and out of that realized that I wanted to try my hand at writing. Joined a writing group and started writing and realized that this really gave me life. So that's where I started to move back into writing, but carried on doing my accounting work. Then after my mother died, journaling and writing became a tool I used in order to process my grief. And it wasn't just that my mother had died, it was the circumstances around her death that were really traumatic and upsetting for me. And so journaling and writing and putting my thoughts on the page became a way for me to engage with my grief, to process it, to try and make sense of it, to grapple with all my questions. And that's how I started to go back into writing in a more tangible way.
Yeah. And way back then, when you were doing this writing to work through your grief, were you already thinking, oh, this should become a book? Or were you just saying, this is a tool I'm using now?
I had always wanted to write a book, and I always thought, oh, one day I'm going to write a book. I never thought it would be this book. But at the time, it was just a tool. I was just using it as a tool. And then my father's death followed on 22 months after my mother's death because he couldn't cope with my mother's death. It was too traumatic for him. He relied on my mother far too much. My father was an alcoholic. And so the death of my mother just absolutely took the base away from him, and his whole life imploded. And so I had my mother's death and the situation around that, my grief, then my father and all he's playing up and all the drama around that. And I was so far away. And And then I did go back and spend some time with him. And this is all part of my book and what's in my book. And so when I had gone through all of that, and I'd been journaling through all of this, I realized I wanted to put this into a book. And the reason I wanted to put it into a book is because when we are very much in grief, I find the reason we get stuck in grief is we are afraid of forgetting the person that we love so much, or we're afraid of forgetting what happened to them or how we felt about them and our emotions. And so because we're afraid of forgetting, we can get stuck because we don't want to leave them behind. And we feel that moving on is traitorous, like we're forgetting them, and we don't want to do that. So that's a dilemma of grief. And then if there's been trauma involved in the death of your loved one, as there was for me, and even my father and his death, there's this this trauma that happens if you keep remembering it. So you don't want to forget it, but to remember it is traumatic. So I realized that if I could put all of this into a book and on the page, I could have it live outside of me, and I could come back to it and read it and evaluate it anytime I wanted. And it lives there. It doesn't have to live in me. And I can visit it anytime I want to. So I won't forget it. But I don't have the trauma of having to remember it either, because there it is outside of me. So it became a tool for me to survive my grief and to put it on the page that could live somewhere else, so that I could move forward and not stay stuck. And so that really, my book became a lifeline for me. And it was only after I wrote it, I thought, well, maybe it can be of value to some other people. And maybe I should now repurpose it, rewrite it in a different way so that it has value for other people. And that's when it actually now became a book.
Yeah. And I want to come back to that topic, but let's talk about your book. Tell us about your book.
Oh, well, it's a short story. It's a short story because I'm factual to the point, and I put my emotions on the page quickly and easily. And it's a story where I explore the parent-child relationship, essentially. So there's three parts to it. First, I explore my mother and my relationship with my mother and her death and my experience of that. That also leads me then to be introspective about my relationship with my mother. And the whole time there's this underlying relationship with my father, and the dysfunction I had with my father versus a close relationship with my mother. And in between the two, what really links them is also my evaluation and searching of my faith. This whole question of my mom's death and how bad things can happen to good people. And I'm like, this really challenged my faith and my understanding, like, if there's a God, how can this really happen? Especially when it hits home so closely with somebody who's very dear to you. So my book is really looking at my relationship with my mother, grappling with the relationship with my father, and then this my faith and how the two actually linked. The death of my mother challenged my faith, and then my faith challenged me in how I'm going to deal with my father going forward.
Yeah. So the book is called When God Says No, because I don't think we've said that yet.
No,
the book
that's right.
is When God Says No. And you can find it, I'm sure, at www.brendasmitjames.com. That is right on the screen for you, and it is in the description. So you first wrote it for yourself, but then when you wrote it for readers, who are you thinking of? Who is your ideal reader?
When I was thinking about my ideal reader, when I rewrote it, I wrote it for women, thinking it would mostly appeal to women, that this wouldn't be a topic that would much appeal to men. So I'll even show you my book. When I designed the cover, I actually, let me just make sure, I designed it with women in mind, because I just felt, and that's me, right? So I did this lovely little cover, and women middle age were really who I thought I was writing for. When people read my book, I was struck by the number of men, and still am struck by the number of men who are impacted by my story. there's something about my story, the way I've written it, and the way it is short and I think succinct, the direct approach I have in my writing, that it resonates with men, and it allows men to actually tap into their emotions, and they tap into their heartbreak, their unfulfilled dreams, their dysfunctional relationships with a parent. And I think what surprised me about that is we often think women have emotional issues and women are the ones who will engage it, but men are stoic and men kind of don't go there, and why should they? They just don't need to. I think there's an untapped area where men don't have the avenue to actually explore their own emotional breakdown and their own emotional baggage. And so I've often been struck by the number of men who've read my book, who are in their 40s and 50s, who reach out to me and say, your book really impacted me, and this is why.
Pardon me, I muted my mic so that I could cough, and then I forgot. Apologies. So, I totally get that, and I don't want to kind of be, I want to be careful of generalizations, but I think for our age group, because you're talking about men in their 40s and 50s, I think back then when children were being raised, it was hug your daughter and kind of slap your son on the back and tell him to go back out to the football field when he's tripped or whatever. And so there was no, a lot of men, I think our age, weren't raised in a place where they were allowed to be emotional, right? So so what is the promise of the book?
The promise of my book is that if you know how to engage grief and hard emotions in a constructive way, you will find your way through it and come to the light again and know what it is to live again. And that is the promise of my memoir.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And we have Estatina Media listening and saying, we just bought your book, Brenda. So there you go.
Thank you so
Live
much.
sale right in the middle of our interview. That's brilliant. Thank you so much, guys. All right. So what has this book done for your life?
It's given me a way to move forward. It's given me a way to not be stuck in my grief. It's given me a way to engage with life again and to move forward. It's given me a YouTube channel. It's given me the opportunity to teach and help other people to write their stories so that they too can find a way forward and they too can find a new way of living their lives and putting their story on the page. So my YouTube channel is really there to motivate people, to encourage them, to let them know they can do this, as well as to give them some guidelines on how to do it.
Yeah, brilliant. So thank you. And it's I love asking authors, because of my book, kind of fill in the blank. I love asking authors that. But if we can just talk about grief and writing for a little while, which means we're talking about grief a little bit. So can you just tell me a little bit about your mother's death really kind of shook your foundations. Can you tell us a little bit about how did your mother's death shake your foundation? Like, how did that kind of spin your life around?
I think, first of all, I wasn't expecting it. My mom had been sick. She had had some issues with some cancer, and she seemed to recover from that. And then she started getting an issue with like an abscess in her mouth, and that was being treated with by the doctors. But my parents in South Africa, there is a 2-tier medical system. And so my parents didn't have the finances, and they wouldn't allow us as children to contribute to help them to have this option, because they were of the opinion that you look after and support your children don't support you. So they were not able to financially afford the private medical system. If you have access to the private medical system in South Africa, or at least then, you get top-notch quality private care. Healthcare. But if you don't, you go to the government medical system, and that leaves a lot to be desired. So my mom was in this government medical system, and it just wasn't meeting her needs, and they were really not helping her with her problem. So I knew she was sick, but I was this far away, living in Canada, that I actually didn't know how sick she was, and nobody really told me. And my mom didn't tell me. So you're going along thinking, oh, mom's not great, but she's not bad, and then next thing you know, she's desperately ill. And you're flying to South Africa to go see her, and then you find out, no, she actually has leukemia, and she dies within 3 days. So that's upsetting. It happened so quickly. But then when I was at the hospital in South Africa, in Johannesburg, I was appalled at the medical treatment she received. And it's in my book, and it was very, very distressing and eye-opening, the lack of care of someone who can't care for him or herself. It was devastatingly traumatic. And that shook me. That really shook me. And then my mom was such a lovely person. She was a woman who loved God. She'd given her life to God. She had lived well. She'd put up with a difficult husband all her life. She hadn't left him. She'd been faithful. She'd done all these things. And then she has this really hard ending to her life that's unfair. And it's like, hey, that is unfair. How can this happen? And then my dad, who's created so much ruckus in our lives, all our lives, like, it just doesn't make sense. There's so much that doesn't make sense here. So this shook my foundation as a Christian, as a believer, saying, what on earth is this for? Why bother? Why be faithful? Why be a God-fearing woman all your life? And this is the end result. It makes no sense. And so that is what shook me and shook my faith and left me going, okay, I don't think that this is a faith I want to follow anymore. I don't think that that Jesus is worth the cost. I just don't see what the point is of all this. So this really became an emotional unpacking for me of what my faith is and how do I make sense of it, and is it even worth following? And that's what I also unpack in my book.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. No matter what religion you follow, if you follow religion and you believe in the mercy of a higher power, to feel like there has been no mercy for someone you've loved so dearly, who's followed everything that they were expected to follow. I fully understand how that could just crack, right? Just crack the surface. And so how did writing help you through that? Can you tell us a little bit about how you used writing?
Yeah, so I used it to journal. So when I came back to Vancouver, I journaled. I spent a lot of time journaling, raising my questions, answering my questions, being angry on the page. It gave me a place to express this emotion and not just keep it inside of me. So I just piled everything into the book. My anger, like, how can this happen? How does this all play out? And so I really grappled with it, and then looked for answers, answers to my questions, including within the Bible. So I put this all together. I worked on it, and I read books. That's the other thing I did, which I touch on as well in the intro to my book, is I just felt inspired to read certain books. And as I read those books from other authors, they really helped fashion and form my thinking and my pain and my heartache and my heartbreak. And so that's how I used the two together. And then I would write out excerpts from those books in my journal, which I also now include in my book, to just try understand where I'm going and what I'm going through and how this is all playing out in my life and what sort of person I want to be coming out of this. And I knew I didn't want to come out of this being an angry, bitter woman. So how am I going to not be that person? And so this is really what writing did for me. It just helped me form and work through a trajectory that just changed my life.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I mean, so it sounds like you started where you were, which was kind of like, dear God, how dare you? Right? And spilling out all the anger, and then moving from there. And I just want to say that Harit and Jewel have said, wow, Brenda, your story is so moving. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm 100% with them. Thank you so much for sharing this with us today.
Thank you.
And so, I understand that, that first exercise is, dear God, how dare you, and spilling it all out. What are some other exercises or writing activities that you did that then helped move you past just as you said, I don't want to be this angry, bitter old woman. So what are some exercises that helped you move past that into a healthier, more productive anger, if it was anger or joy or whatever it moved into?
It wasn't an exercise so much as in doing this process, I experienced a paradigm shift. And I think what we do is we so often see life through our own focus, our own lens, our own prism. Yeah. What going into Johannesburg General Hospital in its derelict state, almost derelict state, did for me, and the lack of care of the nursing staff, and that people in nursing can treat other people the way they do, as if they don't count. Yeah. What that did for me is my brother and I, in particular, one of my brothers and I, were there advocating for my mother, and then and then my other two brothers as well. We were advocating for my mother every inch of the way that we could, within the power constraints we had, because we realized we didn't have any power. The nursing staff had the power. So how do we deal with them? But what struck me was, and this is all part of the paradigm shift I worked through by doing this exercise of journaling and questioning, is what about the people who don't have someone to advocate for them? And there were people in the hospital who didn't have someone to advocate for them because their family couldn't afford to come and be with them in hospital. They couldn't afford to be there and help them. They were totally at the mercy of staff who had little interest in them. And then the stories I heard of what some people have to go through who don't have money, who are poor, really impacted me. And I started seeing that there is a life for other people that is so far from what I expect for myself. And that really wealth does not have to do with how much money you have, but how many choices and options it affords you. And people who don't have money don't have choices. They don't have options. They have to just take what gets given to them, if anything. And so in grappling with this, I experienced two paradigm shifts, but one of them was this one of what is it to be poor? What is it for people who have a harder time than what I experienced with my mother? And so that really shifted me to going, how can I make a difference? My mother dying in a hospital like Joburg General Hospital in the way she did wasn't actually pointless. I felt it was God putting me in a position to pull the blinders off my eyes, to say, this has to hurt you so much so that you can see what other people have to live with. Without it, you would never see it. And so there came this paradigm shift that now has me very passionately involved in trying to make a difference for people who don't have options so that they can have options. And so that's really, I think, how I started to move forward and come out of this grief, was realizing it has a purpose, and how am I going to make it purposeful as I go forward in my life.
Yeah. You found meaning, and you found purpose. Yeah. And that is that in the book? Do you talk about that as well?
I do. I touch on it in the book at the end. But more what I say at the end is that from the sale of the book, and I support an organization in South Africa called Pagamani, which means rise up in Zulu. And it is to help women who are caught in the poverty cycle to be able to start their own businesses. So it's a micro-lending organization started by a couple from Coquitlam, BC, who went to South Africa in order to start this micro-lending organization in the same format of the Grameen Bank by Mohammed Yunus.
Kiva.
Yeah, so they started it. We financially supported, especially through the sale of the book, and this now gives women who are poverty-stricken the opportunity to start businesses. and to get loans, build up a business, get another loan, and provide for their family, and just helps them out of the poverty cycle.
Yes. That's brilliant. I loan money every month to somebody through it's an organization called Kiva, but same basis, right? So brilliant. I think that's beautiful. That's something that beautiful came out of tragedy, right? That I think that's the power of kind of working through your pain to find, where do I put this pain? What do I do with it? So that's so did you kind of write a question at the top of your journal and then work through an answer? Or did you just allow, like, just write whatever, like, just write whatever was coming out?
Write whatever was coming out on that day in that moment. Yeah. And invariably there were some questions. There was something I was working through. And that was probably over a period of, easily 6 months. And then the problem with my father. So my mom's grief was easily 6 months of grappling with it. And then the issue with my father started. And then there was grappling with that issue too. So my journal writing was over a period of, I would say, 22 months that now compiled and I put into my book.
Yeah. So when you had this journal and you kind of come through the other side, because we both help people write memoirs, and this is a question. Some people come and they're like, I want to write my memoir, and they haven't written anything for themselves yet. They haven't done the journaling, and they haven't done the exploration, and they haven't done the coming through the other side, and they want to start writing a journal for readers. And what I often say, and I'm going to ask you what you would say, what I often say is, like, first write for yourself. The first time you write your story, the only reader is you. The only audience is you, because you need to work through all of that before you can find the pieces for a different audience. So, when should someone decide to go from kind of like that personal writing about their own grief to writing their memoir? I want to ask you that question too.
I would agree with you. Write first for yourself. And I think the reason being, especially if you're writing a topic like this, I think if you're writing a memoir that doesn't have all the angst perhaps as a memoir like this would have, I would still say write first for yourself, because it helps you find your true voice, the one that speaks authentically, not the one that's trying to tell something to somebody else. So it's a case of always finding our authentic voice first. But in writing something about a traumatic event or grief or something that's highly emotional, I think it's always important to get it out on the page first, to get through that raw emotion that's really only for you and for your eyes. It's not what anybody else actually wants to witness or read about. They're not interested. I mean, maybe for some interest value perhaps, but honestly, your raw emotion is just too raw for most people. And it doesn't make good reading material. So it's good to get your raw emotion out on the page, say everything you want to say it, the way you want to say it, no holds barred, and then to go through it and then to see what is it in your story that actually has value for somebody else. Because that's the whole point with writing and switching from being someone who's just experiencing their own emotion and putting it on the page in journaling. You're now ready to actually find what is the element in here that you can share with somebody else who, as the reader, will now find this interesting, because their own life will actually cross over with it. They'll see their own life in it. It's not just a case of being a witness to what's happened to you. And I called it, when you can do that, you actually become what I call being invisible on the page. Until you can actually move yourself off the page and your story now just becomes a way to illustrate a truth that you want to tell somebody else, you're going to always be on that page and you're going to be front and center, and it's not going to be readable material for somebody else. So it's at that point where you've dealt with your emotions, you now can move yourself off center stage, and your story is now just illustrating a life truth for somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. And BK is saying great advice. Thank you, Brenda. How do we know when we're ready to make that switch? Like, how do you know when you're ready to do that? And what should you consider?
On my YouTube channel, I often encourage writers to trust the process, to trust their own instincts. I think there's always such a balance between the rules and knowing what the rules are of writing, and trusting the process, trusting your instincts. So I would say, if you're open to trusting the process and instincts, it will come at different times for different people, depending on who you are and what your situation is. But there'll become a time when you've realized, I think I'm ready now. I'm ready now to take all of this and rework it and change the focus of it and make it a book for somebody else. And that really is up to you as to when that process, that turning point comes, and what part of that process it will be.
Yeah. Really good advice. Thank you. Yeah, that's just pondering it all. Timothy John Luke Smith says, hi, everyone. Hi, Timothy. If you have any questions, please drop them in the comments, as we're just going to wrap up here. If you're missing anything, if there's anything you'd like to know, let us know. Brenda, is there anything we're missing? Have I missed anything really important that you want to share about writing and memoir?
I think the only thing I would add, that for me, which you touched on right at the beginning in my intro, is writing looks different for different people. So for me, it's become a lifeline. But it's not that I'm a writer who has all these ideas that constantly build up inside of me, constantly spill out of me. And I feel like I've constantly got to be putting these ideas and thoughts on the page. And there are wonderful writers who, that is how they write. That's who they are. Unless they're writing every day and putting something on the page, that they're just not living. That's who they are. And they have all these ideas and stories they want to put down on the page. And I'm just not like that, which is why I thought for many years I was not a writer. And I would never be a writer. I just had a dream of maybe I'd like to be a writer, because that's not me. And I can go for weeks without writing, and I have no urge to write. I have no great ideas that are spilling out of me onto the page. But then there'll come a time when I sit down to write, whether it be a blog post, whether it be a letter, whether it be some introduction to something, and I'm able to put ideas together. I'm able to articulate things. I'm able to put them on the page, and I enjoy it. I find it really good, and out it comes. And then I may not write again for a while. And yet I still all the time have this dream of, oh, I'm going to write a novel. And I think when the time is right, I am going to write a novel. But it's going to come together at a time that it's now the right time for me to write a novel. So I'm a different type of writer. And I think that it's good for us to realize that there are different people who write in different ways. And writing doesn't necessarily have to look the same way for everybody.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's really important, because we have this vision of what a writer does and how much they write. And that's just not true. So Essetino Media had a question for you, and I have the exact same question. Will you be writing another memoir?
I don't think so. But what I do think I will be writing is a novel. And the reason why is because in writing, this memoir was a very specific memoir. But even in this memoir, there were some things I wanted to say that I didn't say. And the reason I didn't say them is because the whole purpose of my memoir was not to expose other people's issues or faults. It was to grapple with my own emotions, with my parents, and with the situation. But there were things I wanted to say but didn't say, because I didn't want to hurt people. I didn't want to expose other people's faults. I wasn't there to throw anybody under the bus. But there's still issues I feel I want to give voice to. And I think that's something writing does for me. It allows me to give voice to things that I have inside of me. There are other things I've observed in life and in families that strike me as perplexing, and I want to write about them. But if I write about them in a memoir, I have to kind of indicate who I'm talking about. And I don't want to do that because I don't want to hurt anybody. It's not about exposing people, again, as I said, with their faults. It's not about holding up a beacon to them and saying, hey, this is how you've acted and this is how it's impacted me. But I do want to explore that behavior. So I think what I'm going to be doing is writing a novel. And in that novel, I will be able to explore and unpack behaviors, family dynamics, things that happen that I find are interesting and would make a good story. So they say a lot of novels are actually true stories. And so I think there's just a lot I want to explore that memoir is not the medium for it, but novel is.
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, when I speak to fiction authors, I work only with nonfiction, but I speak with fiction authors all the time, and they almost always have something in their real life that they are working on or grappling with, and they've decided to write a fiction about it, but on the moon, rabbits on the moon, because it's so far removed from the real situation that they can take these rabbits who live on the moon and have this whole story around it and work through these issues without harming anyone, throwing anyone under the bus, and all of these things, which really not appropriate, right? Really
No,
not appropriate.
Yeah.
So Timothy John Luke Smith says, it's wonderful that you shared your memoirs and ideas, Brenda. Yes, thank you very much. And I also love your channel, Melody. Thank you, Timothy, for loving my channel as well. And which reminds me, Brenda, you have a channel, right? Would you tell us a little bit about your channel?
So I started my channel a year and a half ago, and the whole idea is to help other people to write their memoirs, to write their stories. So it's called Write Your Story, but it's under my name, Brenda Smit-James. And I put videos out there once a week that are inspirational, motivational, that also discuss the bones of writing a memoir and things one needs to consider. And so I find it challenging and I find it life-giving all at the same time. So I definitely want to keep turning out videos until I've had my channel for 2 years. And then I think I really do want to scale back a little bit on my channel and get back into this writing, because I find it does take a good amount of my time to research a video, to record it, to edit it, to finalize it, to upload it, and then to start working on the next one as well. So that's my focus again now for the next while. And then after that, I will still be keeping my channel going. I'll still be putting out videos, but I really want to free up space to explore this novel that I have ticking around in my brain.
That's brilliant. I love it. I love it. Timothy says he is looking forward to your novel. So we want you to just make some space for that so that we can read it when it is out. And I'd love to talk with you again about it. So if you're interested in Brenda's YouTube channel, it is youtube.com/C/Brenda Smit-James. That is also in the description. Thank you very much, Brenda. Last question. Where can people get a hold of you?
If you want to contact me, the best place to do that is through my website. On my website, there's a Let's Connect tab and a Let's Connect form. So you can fill that in and just say, let's connect, and I'll get back to you, or let me know what you'd like to connect over or about or what you're looking for. And that is really the best way to connect with me.
Yeah. And that's brendasmitjames.com, and it's on the screen right now. And again, it is in the description. Thank you so much, Brenda, for coming out today and having this conversation. And thank you too for being raw and being vulnerable, because I think it's really, really important that, we talk about writing in a real sense, and we talk about, how it can help us through trauma and grief in a very real way, rather than kind of brushing the surface. So I just want to thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
For everyone out there, next Thursday, is the final show of the season. We have been going straight for 11 months now. So Author Nation is taking a break from the live show in July and August. But next week, we have a really special guest. Her name is Jenny Story. And if you think that people with autism can't act, write books, and be animators and do all the things that they dream of doing, join us next Thursday to bust those myths. We will see you then.